In the decades following World War II, amid the rubble and trauma of destroyed cities and repressive regimes, Poland embarked on a curious journey, one lit not by ideology alone, but by tubes of glowing gas. The Neonisation of Poland was a state-sponsored visual campaign that flooded the streets of Warsaw and other urban areas with vibrant neon signs during the 1950s and 1960s. These signs were not just decorative, they were designed, managed and distributed by the state through organisations like glamour, and they served both as public art and as propaganda. Unlike their Western counterparts, which was driven by capitalist branding, Polish neons carried a subtler message: modernity, optimism and progress under socialism. The resulting visual landscape was one of paradox and poetry, a surreal attempt to bring glamour to a grey, authoritarian reality. The backdrop to this phenomena was a political shift that reverberated across the Eastern Bloc. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, countries such as Poland, East Germany, Romania and Bulgaria began to experience what would be termed the Khrushchev thaw. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his infamous secret speech, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and initiating a slow, cautious loosening of repressive Soviet-controlled territories. In Poland, this meant a moment of relative liberalization. Restrictions on literature, film and art were relaxed. Jazz and Western cinema found their way into Polish homes. Urban design began to reflect more openness, and in that environment, neon signs emerged not only as markers of shops and services, but as signs, literally and figuratively, of change. The appeal of neon is partially scientific. Neon signage works by passing electrical current through glass tubes filled with noble gases like neon, argon, and krypton. When electrified, these gases become plasma and emit light. Neon glows red, argon glows blue and krypton yellow, and helium gives off a pinkish hue. The glass tubes can be bent into letters or shapes, and when lit, produce dazzling colours that can last for years. Though the first neon signs were developed in France in the early 20th century by Georges Claude, the idea caught on globally. By the 1920s and 1930s, cities like Paris, New York and Chicago had embraced neon as a symbol of metropolitan glamour, and though Poland experimented with neon before World War II, it was the trauma of war that neonisation. Warsaw in the 1920s and 30s was the city of optimism. The newly independent Second Polish Republic was embracing modernity, and its capital thrived. Neon lights began to appear, echoing the energy of Western capitals. One of the first neon signs appeared in 1926, advertising a brewery using illuminated bottles. But the true spark came from E. Weedle, the country's premier, commissioned a new sign to replace its hand-painted storefront. The result was a boy riding a zebra, balancing 3 massive chocolate bars. This whimsical, imaginative image was designed by Leonetto Cappiello, the Italian-French designer whose work greatly influenced the development of Polish advertisement. This era was full of experimental cafes, jazz clubs, and avant-garde artists, and created a fertile ground for visual innovation. Though much of this culture would be destroyed in World War II, the memory of it lingered, and it was partially revived during Neonisation as an effort to recapture this lost energy. Following World War II, Poland fell under Soviet influence, and its capital was almost entirely destroyed. The post-war reconstruction of Warsaw under communist leadership was both a physical and ideological task. Architecture followed Stalinist mandates, favouring grand and austere buildings. Yet, even as these heavy structures were being erected, the Polish state saw the need to humanise and modernise the city. Enter the Neonisation initiative to illuminate Warsaw and other cities with glowing signs that could blend socialist realism with modern aesthetics. Unlike the West, where businesses created their own advertising, Poland's neons were centrally controlled. The job was given to Reklama, a government agency responsible for the design, approval and distribution of all advertising in the country. Reklama played a crucial role in the shaping of Polish neon aesthetic. The organisation was staffed by architects, engineers, graphic designers and artists. Despite operating under a communist regime, Reklama managed to create space for innovation and creativity. Since Western logos and commercial branding were banned, Reklama's neon signs leaned on stylized imagery and imaginative compositions rather than heavy text. The goals were one of many. Functionality. Signs were used to identify locations of bakeries, pharmacies, travel bureaus, and cinemas. Aestheticization. Reclama was expected to beautify cities, making them appear modern and cultured. And propaganda. Many signs had subtle ideological messages, reinforcing state policies or national pride. Some of the most famous Reclama Commission signs include Let's Rearm Poland on the Sea, promoting national maritime development, a glowing volleyball player in motion advertising a sports club, and a centaur shooting a bow, symbolizing fantasy and forward momentum. These signs were striking in both form and function, clear enough to be read but abstract enough to invite interpretation. This ambiguity gives designers the ability to slip small acts of subversion into otherwise state-sanctioned media. From the late 1950s to the early 1970s, Poland's cities were transformed into radiant canvases. At night, streets buzzed with colour. Red, blue and gold hues reflected off wet cobblestones. The neon signs provided an aesthetic escapism from the shortages and control of daily life. Neons created a false familiarity with the West. Cities like Warsaw and Lodz began to resemble capitalist metropolises without actual consumer goods. There were no Coca-Cola signs or golden arches. Instead, one might see a neon duck above a butcher shop or a woman blowing a kiss outside a cosmetics kiosk. Yet, this illusion of modernity served the state's interests. It allowed the regime to signal progress with style whilst maintaining strict control over content. It was capitalism without commerce, art without ownership, and glamour without freedom. By the late 1970s, Poland was once again in crisis. Economic downturns, food shortages, and growing political unrest led to wide dissatisfaction. In 1981, the communist government imposed a martial law in an attempt to quash the Solidarity movement, a growing opposition force led by Lech Walesa. Power cuts and blackouts became frequent. Neons went dark, both literally and symbolically. Many signs fell into disrepair or were decommissioned due to energy rationing. Poland's streets, once joyfully glowing, were dimmed, mirroring the nation's growing despair. As communism began to collapse in the late 80s and early 90s, newly democratic Poland sought to distance itself from its Soviet past. Neon signs, now seen as relics of that era, were stripped from buildings. Modern billboards and global logos replaced them as the country moved towards free market capitalism. In recent years, Polish neon was seen as a resistance, thanks in large part to the efforts of cultural institutions, artists and preservationists. The most important is the Neon Museum in Warsaw, founded by the photographer Iona Karowinska and the graphic designer David Hill. This museum has rescued dozens of vintage signs from demolition sites and forgotten rooftops. Visitors can now see signs like the Sewing Woman, which is a symbol of women's labour, the Bacchus Wine Bar Neon, which is an animated bottle pouring hand, and the Serena, a sign from the famous Polish car factory. The neonization of Poland was more than a beautification project. It was a national experiment in urban psychology. Against the backdrop of rubble, repression and ideology, neon signs offer colour, fantasy and even subtle forms of resistance. Through Reclama and other state-run bodies, the Polish government created a unique visual identity, one that both mirrored and mocked the West, that inspired the public whilst reinforcing the regime. And that's it for today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. I thought the pictures were just incredible. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like if you